The sky was torn apart that day. Not with fiery streaks of missiles or the chaotic whine of jets, but with silence, an ominous, unbroken silence. The ship wasn't sleek or jagged like the sci-fi books described. It was absurdly utilitarian, like a flying warehouse wrapped in gunmetal gray. It hovered above Earth's atmosphere, casting a shadow so large it turned noon into twilight. People called it the obelisk because it just sat there watching, waiting. Humanity's collective heart beat louder than ever, a primal fear echoing through the streets. But the silence only deepened. Cities paused, airports grounded, and even wars screeched to a halt as every eye turned skyward. It wasn't the first time aliens had been theorized. There had been whispers of UFOs, speculative documentaries, and blurry photos. But this wasn't a whisper. It was a roaring, undeniable truth. They were here, and they weren't in a hurry to explain themselves. Days passed, and the obelisk refused to budge. It didn't broadcast messages. It didn't shoot lasers or drop pods of invaders. It simply loomed. And then, 2 weeks in, everything changed. Lieutenant Angela Edgehart had been awake for 32 hours. She sipped stale coffee from a dented mug in the heart of Cheyenne Mountain Complex, watching the live feed on the holographic monitors. Hundreds of cameras, satellite images, and radar scans fed into a seamless display of the obelisk. Yet nothing new appeared. Just more gray, more ominous stillness. Edge wasn't your average soldier. She was a sharp-tongued strategist, good at finding flaws in situations no one else dared to think about. But this was different. How do you plan for something that doesn't move? Anything? She asked aloud, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Negative, replied Sergeant Baker from his console, a scruffy man who chewed sunflower seeds like they were the last thing holding him together. Thermal scans, sonar, infrared, all blank. Just sitting there. Still no emissions. Edge cursed under her breath. No radio contact. No hostile action. Not even an indication of propulsion systems. It was like the obelisk wasn't even real, just a glitch in the sky. But she knew better. It was here for a reason. Her musings were interrupted by the piercing wail of an alarm. Red lights strobed across the room, and an AI voice boomed across the speakers. Inbound object detected. Velocity, Mach 7. Origin, unknown. Impact imminent. Coordinates? Edge barked, her senses snapping into focus. Baker's fingers flew over his keyboard. Mid-Pacific. Uninhabited zone, thank God. Closest island is 150 miles out. Get me visuals now. The monitors flickered, and an orbital drone feed zoomed in on the impact site. A fiery streak split the sky as something small, sleek, and unmistakably alien descended like a meteor. It slammed into the ocean, sending up a plume of water that reached into the stratosphere. For a few moments, the room went silent again, the weight of the unknown hanging heavy in the air. Impact confirmed, Baker said, his voice quieter now. Object is intact. Estimated size, 10 meters in diameter. No debris. Edge clenched her fists. Deploy recon. I want a full analysis before we... Another alarm cut her off. Multiple objects detected. Global dispersion pattern. Velocity, Mach 7. Total count, 47. Her stomach dropped. The monitors lit up like Christmas, marking dozens of trajectories across the globe. Every continent was a target. Every ocean, every corner of the map. Within minutes, Earth became a chessboard and humanity had just realized they were pawns. The first boots hit the ground within the hour. Autonomous drones and AI-controlled subs were dispatched to the Pacific impact zone. Satellite feeds zoomed in on the submerged alien object, which glowed faintly beneath the waves. It wasn't long before the rest of the world followed suit, sending their best and brightest to investigate their respective crash sites. What they found was unexpected. The objects weren't weapons. They weren't scout ships. They were stakes, or at least that's what they looked like. Roughly 10 meters tall, each one resembled a smooth, obsidian rod embedded firmly into the earth. No visible mechanisms. No inscriptions. Just black, silent monoliths standing defiantly in their chosen spots. And then the murmurs began. This is some kind of message, one scientist speculated. No, countered another. They're claiming territory. Mapping out borders. But Edge saw something different. She leaned over Baker's console, scrutinizing the data feeds. Every stake had landed in a tactically significant position. Water supply lines. High-altitude surveillance zones. Major fault lines. Energy hubs. These aren't just markers, she whispered. They're choke points. Whoever planted these knows exactly how to control us. 2 days later, humanity's fears were confirmed. The stakes weren't just sitting there anymore. They were emitting low-frequency signals, pulses that spread through the ground like invisible waves. Earthquakes were recorded in areas that had been stable for centuries. Magnetic fields shifted. Entire ecosystems were thrown into chaos. And then came the coup de grace. Human technology started failing. Planes dropped out of the sky without warning. Power grids overloaded. Satellites lost communication. Anything within a 500-mile radius of the stakes was rendered useless. Edge stood in the command center watching as reports poured in. "They're hurting us," she muttered. "Cutting off our resources. Making sure we can't organize a response." "But why?" Baker asked. "Why not just wipe us out if they're so advanced?" Edge didn't have an answer. She didn't like not having answers. The world descended into chaos within hours. Cities went dark. Nations panicked. And yet the obelisk still didn't move, looming silently in the upper atmosphere. Humanity's enemies were playing a long game, and no one could figure out the rules. But Edge had an idea. A dangerous, desperate idea. "Get me a transport," she ordered. "Transport?" Baker's brow furrowed. "To where?" She pointed at the Pacific stake on the monitor. "I want to see one of these things up close." "You can't be serious. Those zones are death traps. No comms, no backup, nothing?" "Exactly." Edge's lips curled into a grim smile. "If they've gone to all this trouble to cripple us, it means they're afraid of what we can do. That's a weakness we can exploit." Baker hesitated, then gave a resigned nod. "You're insane, you know that?" "Damn right I am." As the transport prepped for departure, Edge couldn't shake the feeling that this was humanity's last chance. Whatever the stakes were doing, they weren't invincible. And if she was right, the solution might be so simple, so primal, that the alien invaders would never see it coming. She gripped her sidearm tightly and whispered to herself, "It only takes one crack to break the whole system." Little did she know, she was about to become the stick that shattered the unshakable. The Pacific air was sharp and heavy with moisture as the transport roared over the ocean. Lieutenant Angela Edgehart sat in the cramped cabin of the VTOL craft, surrounded by a mix of Special Forces operatives and scientists in bulky survival suits. The rhythmic hum of the engines should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Not when she knew the second they crossed into the dead zone, the stakes interference would knock the bird right out of the sky. Edge glanced over at Dr. Elias Fortran, a civilian scientist who had practically begged his way onto the mission. He was wiry and unshaven, with an intensity in his eyes that matched her own. He clutched a battered tablet as though it might save his life. "So," Edge began, breaking the tense silence. "What do we know about these things? Anything useful?" Elias pushed up his glasses, clearly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "Not much. Whatever alloy the stakes are made of isn't from Earth. We've been running spectral analysis, but nothing matches our databases. It's dense, nearly impervious to heat or kinetic energy, and emits low-frequency pulses that seem to destabilize everything in the surrounding environment." Edge raised an eyebrow. "In English, document. They're unbreakable and they're screwing with physics. That's simple enough." "Great," she muttered, leaning back in her seat. "We're heading straight into the jaws of the beast, and you're telling me we don't even know what makes the teeth sharp?" Elias hesitated. "There's one other thing." "Spit it out." "The pulses aren't random. They're coordinated, like a network. If my math is right, these stakes are communicating with each other. Sharing data." Edge's eyes narrowed. "Which means if we figure out how to disrupt one, we could disrupt them all." "That's the theory." She smirked. "Good. I like theories that piss off aliens." The transport hit turbulence as it entered the dead zone. The steady hum of the engines sputtered, and warning lights flashed across the cabin. "Brace yourselves," the pilot shouted over the intercom. Edge gripped the harness strapped across her chest as the craft lurched violently. The dead zone was like flying through molasses, every system fighting against the invisible interference. They were less than 5 minutes out from the stakes coordinates, and already the onboard electronics were glitching. "Can you keep her steady?" Edge barked. "Barely," the pilot replied, sweat dripping down his brow. "But if we don't land soon, we're going to be swimming." The VTOL groaned as it dipped lower toward the ocean. Finally, the rocky silhouette of a small island came into view, shrouded in mist. In the center of the island, rising like a dark, alien obelisk, was the stake. Even from a distance, it seemed to hum with power, a faint distortion in the air around it like a heat wave. "We're coming in hot," the pilot yelled. The VTOL hit the ground hard, skidding across the rocky beach before coming to a shuddering halt. Alarms blared and smoke hissed from the engines. "Everyone out!" Edge shouted, unbuckling her harness. The team scrambled to disembark, dragging their gear with them. The moment Edge's boots hit the ground, she felt it, a low vibration beneath her feet, like the heartbeat of the planet itself. The stake's pulses were stronger here, almost tangible. "Status check," Edge called, scanning her team. "We're good," Elias said, clutching his tablet. "The equipment's taking a beating, but it's functional." "Move out," she ordered. "We're not here for sightseeing." As the team approached the stake, the interference grew worse. Radios crackled with static, GPS devices blinked out, and even the air felt heavier, oppressive. The closer they got, the more Edge's instinct screamed at her to turn back. But she pressed on, jaw set. The stake loomed above them, impossibly smooth and alien. It didn't reflect light so much as absorb it, casting an unnatural shadow across the rocky terrain. The ground around it was barren, as though life itself had been scorched away. Elias stepped forward, his hands trembling as he held up a handheld scanner. "It's incredible," he whispered. "The energy output is off the charts. And look," he pointed at the tablet's display, which showed a web of interconnected lines. "It's not just communicating with other stakes. It's also receiving signals from the obelisk." "Figures," Edge muttered. "Big Brother's watching." She turned to the demolitions expert, Corporal Reed, who was setting up charges around the base of the stake. "You think that's going to work?" she asked. Reed shrugged. "Doubt it. But orders are orders." "Change of plan," Edge said. "Elias, can you isolate one of those signals?" Elias frowned. I think so. Why?" "If we can block it, even for a second, we might find out what these things are hiding." Reed looked up from his charges. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that sounds like poking a bear with a stick." Edge grinned. "Sometimes that's exactly what you need to do." Elias scrambled to reconfigure his scanner, sweat dripping down his face as the interference threatened to fry his equipment. Finally he nodded. "Got it. I can disrupt the signal for a few seconds, but I have no idea what's going to happen." "Do it," Edge ordered. Elias hesitated, then activated the device. A high-pitched whine filled the air, and the stake's hum faltered. For a brief moment the oppressive vibration stopped, and the silence was deafening. Then the stake reacted. A surge of energy erupted from its surface, sending the team sprawling. Sparks flew as the pulse overloaded their equipment. The ground beneath the stake cracked, and a deep, guttural sound echoed through the air, like a machine waking from a long slumber. Edge pushed herself to her feet, ears ringing. "Status?" Elias's voice was shaky. It's adapting. The signal's shifting. I don't think we can jam it again." Before anyone could respond, the stake began to move. The smooth, obsidian surface rippled like liquid, and a section peeled away to reveal something inside. A core of shifting, glowing tendrils that pulsed with an otherworldly light. "What the hell is that?" Reed whispered, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. Edge stared at the exposed core, her mind racing. "It's not just a stake," she said slowly. "It's a relay. A node in a larger system. And we just pissed it off." The ground shook violently, and the tendrils began to extend outward, snaking across the terrain like living wires. They pulsed with energy and the air crackled with static. "Fall back," Ed shouted. "Now?" But as the team scrambled to retreat, the tendrils lashed out, slamming into the ground with enough force to shatter stone. One wrapped around the VTOL, crushing it like a tin can. Edge's heart pounded as she fired her rifle at the tendrils, but the bullets had no effect. "Elias, how do we shut it down?" "I don't know," he shouted, panic in his voice. "We're out of time." Edge's mind raced. The stake wasn't invincible. It had weaknesses, but they were playing on the enemy's terms. If humanity had any chance of survival, they needed to think differently. As the tendrils closed in, she realized the truth. The stakes weren't just tools of control. They were bait, designed to lure humanity into a trap. And they'd walked right into it. The crackle of energy in the air grew deafening, and the ground beneath the team trembled as the alien stake pulsed with terrifying intensity. The exposed core of writhing tendrils spread outward like roots seeking prey, their bioluminescent glow painting the rocky terrain in eerie hues of green and blue. Every step away from the stake felt like running in quicksand, as though the dead zone itself conspired to keep them there. Lieutenant Angela Edged Heart darted behind a jagged boulder, pulling Elias with her just as a tendril slammed into the ground where they'd stood moments before. The impact sent a shower of molten rock into the air. She clutched her rifle, knowing it was practically useless but unable to abandon it. Reed and the remaining soldiers spread out, trying to draw the tendrils' attention. "We need a plan now," Edge shouted over the chaos, her voice raw with urgency. "I don't think it can be destroyed," Elias yelled, his face pale and slick with sweat. His tablet flickered in his hands, the screen glitching out under the stake's interference. "It's adapting faster than anything I've ever seen. Even if we jam the signal, it just recalibrates. Then we don't destroy it," Edge snapped, her mind racing. "We sever it from the network." Elias blinked at her, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. These things are connected, communicating with each other in the obelisk. If we isolate this one, it's vulnerable. They're strong because they're a system. We take that system apart, one piece at a time." Elias hesitated, then nodded slowly as the idea clicked in his head. Okay. But the network isn't just physical, it's also electromagnetic. If we can disrupt its connection to the other stakes, it might shut down or at least stop responding. "How?" Edge asked. "We don't have the tech to block something like this." Elias glanced at the exposed core, the glowing tendrils flickering with each pulse. "It's broadcasting and receiving. We don't block it, we flood it. Overload the relay with so much noise it can't process the signal." Reed, crouched nearby, shouted over the chaos. "And where are we supposed to get enough juice to fry something like that? In case you haven't noticed, we're a little short on resources." Elias's eyes widened, a spark of realization flashing across his face. "The stake itself. It's drawing energy from the environment, it's practically a giant power source. If we can rig something to redirect that energy, we could force it into a feedback loop." Edge's mind locked onto the plan instantly. It was dangerous, borderline suicidal, but it was better than running until they were all dead. "Fine. What do you need?" "A direct connection to the core," Elias said, his voice trembling. "And enough time to set it up." Edge turned to Reed. "Cover us. Keep those tendrils busy." "You're insane," Reed muttered, but he nodded. "You heard the lieutenant. Lay down suppressing fire and keep them distracted." The soldiers opened fire, their bullets sparking harmlessly off the stake and its tendrils. It wasn't about damage, it was about buying precious seconds. Edge and Elias sprinted toward the exposed core, the air around them rippling with heat and static electricity. Reaching the core was like standing in the eye of a storm. The ground was scorched and cracked, and the tendrils thrashed wildly as though sensing the team's intent. The closer they got, the more the vibrations in the air turned into a low, painful hum that reverberated in their skulls. Elias dropped to his knees near the base of the stake, pulling out a small toolkit from his pack. "Keep it off me while I work," he shouted, his hands trembling as he began attaching improvised electrodes to the exposed tendrils. Edge planted herself in front of him, her rifle raised. She fired at the tendrils as they lashed toward them, forcing them back for a moment before they reared up again. Her shots did little more than irritate the massive structure, but she didn't stop. "Hurry it up, Doc," she yelled, sweat dripping into her eyes. "I'm going as fast as I can." Elias snapped, frantically connecting wires to his makeshift jammer. "The energy flow is insane. I need to recalibrate or this thing's going to fry before it even starts." Another tendril slammed into the ground nearby, sending Edge sprawling. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing a grenade from her belt and hurling it at the base of the stake. The explosion sent a shockwave through the air, briefly forcing the tendrils to retract. Move! Reed shouted, laying down suppressing fire as another soldier dragged Edge back to her feet. The team was dwindling fast. One soldier had already been taken by the tendrils, his screams abruptly silenced as he was yanked into the stake's core. Elias finally connected the last wire, his tablet flashing with lines of alien code. "It's ready," he shouted. "But once I trigger it, we need to get clear. This thing's going to blow." "Do it," Edge yelled, firing another burst at the approaching tendrils. Elias hesitated for only a second before slamming his hand down on the tablet's interface. The jammer activated, sending a surge of electromagnetic energy into the stake's core. The reaction was immediate. The stake's pulses faltered, and the tendrils froze mid-motion, their glow flickering erratically. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything was silent. Then the stake let out an ear-splitting screech, and the ground beneath it began to crack apart. Tendrils spasmed wildly, striking everything in sight as the core overloaded. "Fall back," Edge shouted, grabbing Elias by the arm and dragging him away from the imploding structure. The team sprinted toward the beach, dodging falling debris as the stake's energy spiraled out of control. Behind them, the stake let out one final pulse, a shockwave that rippled through the air and sent the team flying. Edge hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of her as a blinding light engulfed the island. When the light faded, the stake was gone. In its place was a smoking crater, the surrounding terrain scorched and lifeless. The air was eerily quiet, the oppressive hum of the dead zone finally gone. Edge pushed herself to her feet, coughing as she surveyed the damage. "Elias," she called out, her voice hoarse. "Oh, I'm here," he replied, crawling out from behind a boulder. His tablet was fried, but he was alive. Did it work? Edge glanced at the horizon, where the other stakes still loomed in the distance. For the first time since the invasion began, one of them was gone. "It worked," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "We took it down?" Reed staggered over, covered in dirt and blood. "One down, 46 to go," he muttered. "Not exactly what I'd call a victory." "It's a start," Edge said, her voice steady. She turned to Elias. "You said these things are connected. If we hit them hard enough, disrupt the network, maybe we can sever their control entirely." Elias nodded, a spark of determination in his eyes. "If we can take down the stakes, we might even have a shot at the obelisk." Edge glanced at the smoldering crater one last time before shouldering her rifle. "Then we keep going. We find the next one and the next until they realize humanity isn't going down without a fight." The team regrouped, battered but alive, as the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, the light didn't feel ominous. It felt like hope. The remnants of Edge's team trudged across the blasted wasteland, their breaths visible in the cold, lifeless air surrounding the obelisk. It towered over them like a mountain, its surface alive with writhing black tendrils that reached high into the atmosphere, disappearing into the storm of crackling clouds above. The stakes had been their lifeline, and now, over the course of weeks, Edge and her team had severed them, one by one. 46 stakes dismantled, burned out, or overloaded. Each victory had cost them lives, and now only 3 remained: Edge, Elias, and Reed. Their mission had brought them to this final moment, the heart of the alien invaders' network. If they could destroy the obelisk, the system would collapse completely. But standing in its shadow, Edge couldn't help but feel the weight of all they'd sacrificed to get here. "How much time do we have?" she asked Elias, her voice weary but resolute. Elias checked the modified tablet he'd rebuilt after losing the original. Its screen flickered with the now familiar patterns of alien code, the same signals they had used to turn the stakes against themselves. "Not long," he said grimly. "The obelisk knows we're here. Those tendrils aren't just for show, they're a defense system. If we don't move fast, it'll fry us before we even reach the core." Reed adjusted the strap on his pack, loaded with the last of their explosives. His expression was grim but determined. "This thing's not invincible. Those stakes thought they were too, and look where that got them. Let's stick to the plan and finish this." Edge nodded, her jaw tightening. "We came this far. No backing out now." The climb to the obelisk's base was a gauntlet of jagged alien terrain and constant, oppressive energy pulses that made every step feel like wading through water. The air itself seemed to resist them, buzzing with invisible currents that pushed against their movements. The tendrils surrounding the obelisk writhed and lashed out unpredictably, each one capable of smashing them into oblivion. Edge led the way, her eyes scanning for patterns in the tendrils' movements. "They're responding to us," she said, her voice low and focused. "Reed, stay close to Elias. We'll need those charges in place before it fully reacts." Elias staggered under the weight of his gear but kept pace. "The stakes were just relays," he said. "This thing, it's the source. It's where all the energy is funneled, processed, and directed. If we can destabilize its core, it dies." Edge finished. "I got it, document. Just keep moving." The first tendril lashed out, and Edge dove to the side, shouting a warning. Reed swung his rifle up, firing an incendiary round that exploded against the tendril's surface. It shrieked, an unnatural metallic sound, but retreated, the flames leaving a faint scorch mark. It wasn't much, but it bought them a few seconds. "We can't keep fighting these things off," Reed shouted. "We need to move faster. Then run." Edge barked, firing her rifle to cover him. "Go." The trio sprinted across the uneven ground, dodging and weaving as the tendrils grew more aggressive. One came down inches from Elias, who let out a startled cry as Edge yanked him out of the way. Another slammed into Reed's path, forcing him to detour as he clutched the detonators. Finally, they reached the obelisk's base. Up close, it was a monstrous wall of shifting, black material, its surface alive with glowing veins of energy. The hum of its power was deafening, vibrating through their bones. "Reed, set the charges," Edge shouted. "Elias, find the weak point." Reed began unpacking the explosives, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the chaos around them. Elias, meanwhile, frantically scanned the obelisk with his tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. It's massive, Elias muttered. But the core is near the top. That's where the signal is strongest. We don't have time to climb it, Edge said. Can we trigger a chain reaction from here? Maybe, Elias said. If we overload the lower conduits, the energy feedback might cascade upward. But it's a long shot. It's all we've got, Edge said. Do it. Reed finished planting the charges just as the obelisk reacted. The tendrils around them went rigid, their movements becoming unervingly precise. They weren't lashing out randomly anymore, they were targeting. They know what we're doing, Elias shouted, his voice barely audible over the rising hum. One tendril shot toward Reed, who barely had time to turn before it impaled him through the chest. His eyes widened in shock as he gasped for air, blood staining his uniform. Reed? Edge screamed, firing wildly at the tendril. It recoiled, pulling him with it, and disappeared into the obelisk's surface. Elias froze, his face pale. Oh my God. Focus. Edge snapped, her voice breaking. Reed wouldn't want us to stop. Finish the job. Tears streaked Elias's face, but he nodded, his fingers trembling as he completed the final connection on the tablet. The charges blinked green, ready to detonate. It's done, Elias said, his voice hollow. We just need to trigger them. Edge grabbed the detonator from Reed's discarded pack and shoved it into Elias's hands. Get to a safe distance. Now, what about you? Elias asked, panic in his eyes. I'm staying, Edge said. Someone has to make sure this thing goes down. If it resists the first blast, I'll finish it manually. No. You don't have to. Go. Edge shouted, pushing him toward the edge of the blast zone. That's an order. Elias hesitated, then turned and ran, tears streaming down his face. Edge watched him go, her heart heavy. She hadn't come this far to leave the job unfinished. The tendrils closed in as Edge stood her ground, rifle in one hand and the detonator in the other. The obelisk seemed to sense her defiance, its pulses growing stronger, the ground shaking violently beneath her feet. This is for everyone you've taken from us, Edge growled, her finger tightening on the trigger. For Reed. For my team. For Earth. She pressed the button. The charges detonated in a blinding explosion, and the base of the obelisk erupted in a cascade of energy and fire. The tendrils flailed wildly, their movements erratic as the structure began to destabilize. The glowing veins along its surface dimmed and flickered, and the oppressive hum faltered. But it wasn't enough. The obelisk let out a deafening roar, its core pulsing violently as it fought to stabilize itself. Edge didn't hesitate. She grabbed the remaining explosives from Reed's pack and sprinted toward the exposed conduits, her body screaming in protest. She planted the charges directly on the glowing veins, her hands shaking as she armed them. The tendrils lashed at her, one grazing her side and sending her sprawling. Pain shot through her, but she forced herself to her feet. With her last strength, she triggered the second detonation. The explosion tore through the obelisk, its core shattering in a brilliant burst of light. The tendrils went limp, and the towering structure began to collapse, its immense form disintegrating into ash and molten fragments. Edge fell to her knees, her vision blurring as the shockwave knocked her flat. She felt the heat of the blast, the vibrations rattling her very soul. And then, silence. When Elias returned, the obelisk was gone. The landscape was scorched and barren, but the oppressive hum was no more. The alien network had fallen silent. He found Edge lying in the rubble, barely breathing. Her armor was scorched and her face was pale, but she was alive. You did it, Elias said, his voice breaking as he knelt beside her. You actually did it? Edge managed a faint smile. Told you, we'd make them regret coming here. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the stormy sky, Elias looked up at the horizon. For the first time in months, the alien structures were gone. The Earth was quiet again. Humanity had won. But the cost would never be forgotten.